at the conclusion of our internship, we sold the 39 Plymouth and took the train back to Bremen, and then stayed with her folks in Bremen. And we needed to buy a car. There was a Chevrolet dealer in Bremen. Cars were not easy to come by because the war had just concluded, and they were hard to get, but they got agreement to their friends in Bremen to sell a new 46 Chevrolet. And so then I went down to, we had about $300 or $400, so I could put down on the car. We went to the banker with her father to make arrangements for paying for it. And I remember distinctly walking in, and the banker was, like most bankers, a big, fat guy. He was very friendly and very nice. And I told him that I was a doctor and I needed to buy a car, and I had $400 that I was going to put down on it, and I'd like to buy it there in Bremen. And he said, well, what is your security? And I said, I don't have any other security, but if we put that much down, that ought to be good enough, shouldn't it? He says, no, we would have to have some more security than that. I said, well, that her father, Clyde, said he'd sign the note with me. And the banker said, oh, well, if he's going to sign the note, that's all right. That doesn't make a bit. You don't need any more security than that. And so we got the banker to give us the money to buy the car. We continued from there on over to Frederick, Maryland. I owed the government 2 years of service for having been put through medical school as a private, and I was going to be made a lieutenant in the medical corps, and I had to serve 2 years. They sent me directly to Camp Dietrich because of my background in bacteriology, with a PhD and an MD, and my internship completed. At Camp Dietrich, I was assigned to Dr. Weedham, who was head of the safety division, and I was chief of the special procedures branch. The special procedures branch was charged with the responsibility for giving immunization injections to the people who worked on the research, in the restricted area, doing research on different bacterial diseases. So that I was in charge of immunizing them. If and when, and they did get sick, I was the doctor in charge of taking care of them and treating them. And we had a hospital that I worked in to take care of the patients. Dr. Weedham also explained a third thing that was important from their point of view, and that was that to maintain a good attitude towards the immunization program and the safety division, it would be helpful if I would be willing and frequently talk and develop friendships with the people that worked in the restricted area. And these were generally scientists who were very well known and outstanding, and others who were good scientists but not. I got along fine in the job. I learned quickly that there were about a half a dozen infectious diseases that I had to become an expert in, and I took care of patients who developed those diseases, and published a few papers on the treatment of those patients. by taking care of the people who became ill, I developed a good reputation with the employees of the camp, and was thought to know what was going on and what the diseases were like. And especially one day when in comes a lady with her dog and comes into my office and says her dog had been sick for the past week, and she wanted to make sure he wasn't sick with any diseases he might have gotten from the restricted area, from the research that was going on. And I remember Dr. Weedham saying we ought to try and be nice to everybody, so I examined the dog and told her I didn't think there was anything that came from inside the restricted area. And when the administrative assistant of the hospital heard about this, why, he drew a cartoon of the dog sitting up in my table and talking to me and telling me, and don't give me any of those damn APCs either, APCs being aspirin, and flicking the fleas off of him. From seeing patients and on the background of a scientific background of understanding how diseases spread, I was intrigued by the exposures that these patients had to the various diseases when they worked. And in several instances, it was the same kind of experiment where a machine leaked bacteria into the air, and person breathed in that air and then came down with the disease that they were working with. And this happened often enough that I began to think, if it's important to know how many bacteria infect a person, this is a way that someone might be able to set up an experiment using what we call simulants, bacteria that do not cause disease, but to let the machine that was leaking bacteria leak these simulants and see what the count of bacteria in the air was. And they knew how long the person had been working in that area, so they could figure out how much of a dose the person got that brought him down with this disease. This could be brucellosis, which was the most important one. It could also be tularemia or some other diseases that we had. I proposed this program to Dr. Weedham, who was the chief of the division. Not that we would do it, but that someone in authority should consider whether this would be a research program that would be worth instituting. And he was in favor of it, but when he presented it to the division chiefs meetings, it did not get a very strong and did not get any endorsement. And he came back to me and said that he wasn't able to sell the program at all. But about 3 months later, a consultant to the Camp Dietrich, who was assigned or who was attached to or advising Dr. Weedham and the safety division and the scientific director on things that he could learn from being a consultant, he came to my office. And it was Dr. Dack, who was a well-known scientist from the University of Chicago. And he sat down. I knew about him, and he's a very famous person. And he was just so very friendly. And he said, "Tom, is there anything that you see that you think would be good for me to know?" And so I unloaded on him with the program that I had just described to Dr. Weedham, and told him that Dr. Weedham had not been able to sell it. And he said, well, you know, it sounds like a very important thing to me, and let me see what I can do. And so, lo and behold, he went back to the scientific director of the whole place and explained the program and recommended that they do it. And Weedham came back to me and said that they had accepted it at Dietrich and they were going to do it. Well, I never heard another word about it officially because it was not up to me to know whether or not it was being done or not. But in about 5 years, someone told me that he had been working on that project and it had been completed. And about 15 years later, a key individual who had been a colonel and head of the Chemical Corps Camp Dietrich operation told me that the data they got from those experiments was data that the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Defense Department used in considering whether to continue supporting and how heavily to support research on bacterial warfare. So it turned, and that he said it was a very important set of data, and that he and just a few others knew where it came from. So he wanted to tell me. He has since died, so I don't have to say who it is or who it was, but he knew what he was talking about because he was on the WSEG, Weapons Systems Evaluation Group, which studied all of the different things that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had to consider and decide upon. So that was the most important single thing that I did at Dietrich, and no one else had suggested that in the 8 years that the scientists and everyone else had been there. I kept wondering, why did I think of it? And it was because I had had a course in epidemiology as a graduate student where I had been impressed and told about a non-medical person who was the first, quote, epidemiologist in the world, studied the occurrence of diseases in London in the 1600s and found that everybody who drank water from a certain pump developed typhoid fever. Not everyone, but so that he was able to get rid of the pump and the diseases stopped. And it was this kind of scientific approach to the thinking that led me to, I think, to think seriously about what was an important problem in bacteriological warfare. So, with that, I stayed on as 1 year as a civilian at Dietrich, and by then we had 3 growing children who were having a lot of fun and enjoying life. And I decided that if I was going to be a well-trained doctor, I needed to get additional training in internal medicine. In other words, I was really good authority on infectious diseases, but I needed to have further training in a residency program. I talked with the intern, Bill Todd, who was on my internship with me in Tacoma, Washington. I finagled a trip out to California, and he was in Millbrae, California on a psychiatric residency. And I talked to him about it, the, that I would like to get a residency in internal medicine, and he suggested the San Francisco VA hospital as being a good training system because it was, quote, a dean's list hospital. And that meant that deans of Stanford Medical School and University of California Medical School were in charge of the training of specialists of all kinds at that hospital. So with that as a goal, I finagled another trip out later to talk brucellosis with one of the world's authorities on brucellosis, a man named Dr. K.F. Meyer. Dr. Meyer was a wonderful person in that he agreed. I'd never met him before, never heard of him. I wrote him and said, I'd like to talk brucellosis because I've seen patients that don't seem to have gotten a different impression of what their illness is from what you have published, because you don't believe that the disease can become a chronic disease, and these people have had a chronic disease, and I know they have because I've proved it. So he was glad. He received me, and instead of an hour, we spent 2 or 3 hours talking about it. And I knew then what a reputation he had and what a wonderful person he was. He had done research on more different diseases and more different things than any one man I've ever known. At the end of our conversation, I told him that I was trying to think of the San Francisco VA hospital as a place to get further training in internal medicine. And I'll never forget, he kind of smiled. He said, and I asked him if he thought he would be willing to write me a letter recommending that I can go there because I knew it was competitive. He said, well, I've known Gordon Hine, who was the head of the medical division over there at the hospital, and done some favors for him. So I think I could maybe be of help to you, and I'll write a letter for you. Well, I was greatly relieved, and later I found out, number one, that there were over 150 guys applying for residency training there. That most of them came from California Medical School and from Stanford, and there were only 3 or 4 that were not. I was one of the 3 or 4 nots, and was accepted for their program. I thought, gee, I must be pretty great to impress him, Dr. K.F. Meyer, that quick. I later found out from talking to Ed Steinhaus that he and Ed Steinhaus were good friends, that Ed Steinhaus had gotten his job at the University of California on the basis of Dr. K.F. Meyer recommending him, and they were close over a period of 8 to 10 years. They were close friends.